July the 4th, 1854, Louisiana. The morning broke heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down like an iron hand. Cicadas screeched from the trees, and the smell of roasted hog drifted from the town square, while white citizens of the parish, dressed in clean linen and polished shoes, preparing for the great celebration of liberty. Isaac Brooks was already awake, already sweating under the lash of orders. He had been chosen for the spectacle. They marched him from the quarters, across the dusty road, past the sugarcane fields, where men bent double under the sun. He was not shackled, but he may as well have been. The overseer's eyes were the chain around his throat. At the church gates, a crowd waited. Children clutched little flags. Women fanned themselves beneath wide hats. Men laughed, brandishing pipes and bottles, their faces flushed with self-satisfaction. The bell tower above them began to ring, each toll declaring freedom, liberty, and the destiny of a young nation. Yet at the foot of those very steps, Isaac was forced to kneel. They pushed a rag into his hand, and the young master, barely a man, perhaps 17, thrust out his boots. "Polish them," he said, his voice loud enough for the congregation. "Polish them clean enough to see the sky." The crowd laughed, some clapped. A preacher lifted his hand as though blessing the scene. Isaac lowered his head and obeyed. His scarred hands moved with mechanical precision, rubbing away the dust from leather that had never touched chains. Around him voices rose in song hymns to liberty, to God's gift of freedom, to the memory of 1776. Every note was a knife. Isaac did not sing. He pressed the rag harder, polishing until he saw his reflection in the black sheen of the boot. What he saw was not a man, but a shadow bent double, the lines of his face blurred by sweat and scars. That reflection mocked him, bowed, unfree, humiliated at the altar of another people's liberty. The irony cut deeper than any whip. Here, in front of the church, the very place where sermons declared that all men were equal before God, he was made to kneel as proof of inequality. Here, where the bells rang in honor of freedom, he was paraded as evidence that chains were eternal. He did not lift his eyes, but in his chest something smoldered. Isaac had been born beyond the sugarcane rows, in a cabin where the roof leaked and the air always smelled of damp wood and smoke. His first lullabies were the groans of his mother as she bent over the washboard, the curses of overseers, the cries of the hungry. He grew up knowing that laughter from the big house meant pain for the quarters, that silence was safer than honesty, and that the whip drew maps across a boy's back long before he learned the alphabet. The scars on his shoulders and spine were not random. Each line was a record of survival. Each welt marked a year endured, a lesson forced into his flesh. Never speak unless spoken to, never run unless ordered, never dream unless you wish to suffer. But Isaac did dream, quietly, in the dark. He dreamed of standing without bowing, of speaking without fear, of seeing the horizon beyond the cane fields. As a child, he had once asked his mother why the white folk celebrated the 4th of July. She had looked at him with eyes dulled by years and said, "Because they can, Isaac. Because they forget there are chains." He never asked again. Now, as a grown man of 26, he did not need to ask. He knew the answer. The chains were the foundation of that liberty. The sugar that sweetened their pies was drawn from backs like his. The hymns that swelled in the church came from throats that had never tasted the gag of silence. Their freedom was built upon his unfreedom. The young master shifted his foot impatiently, pressing the toe of his polished boot against Isaac's shoulder. "Faster," he demanded, his voice cracking with arrogance. Isaac complied, though his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the force of what he held back. The congregation laughed again, mistaking cruelty for entertainment. Some whispered that it was a fine lesson for the slaves to see one of their own brought low before God and men, made an example of what obedience looked like. They thought it broke him. They thought humiliation clolled the spirit, but humiliation was a seed, and in Isaac it found soil dark and deep. When the bells finally ceased and the hymn ended, the master yanked his boot away. "Good enough," he said with disdain, as though Isaac's labor meant nothing. He turned to the gathered crowd, smiling as though he had won some victory. The preacher stepped forward, Bible raised, and declared the day holy, the nation blessed, and the order of things righteous. The people cheered. Fireworks cracked in the distance. Isaac was dismissed back to the quarters. He walked slowly, the rag still damp in his hand, the taste of dust still in his mouth. Around him, the plantation stirred with the false joy of the holiday. White families feasted, black bodies labored. For some, July 4th was a day of freedom. For Isaac Brooks, it was a day of revelation. That night, in the cabin where shadows swallowed the corners and the air was thick with sweat, Isaac lay awake. He heard the echoes of the bells, the laughter of the crowd, the smug voice of the master. He traced the scars on his back with calloused fingers, following their paths like rivers of memory. Each scar was a reminder of what had been done. Each scar was also a promise of what would one day be undone. He did not speak these thoughts aloud. The walls of the cabin had ears. Silence was safer, but within that silence, Isaac made a vow. One day, the bells would not mock him. One day, he would not bow at the gates of freedom. One day, he would turn humiliation into fire and fire into judgment. For now, he closed his eyes. Outside, fireworks painted the sky red and gold. Inside, he dreamed not of stars and stripes, but of smoke and reckoning. The night Rachel was taken, the sky split with thunder. It was the kind of storm that shook windows in the big house, but gave no shelter to the quarters. Rain hammered the roofs of the cabins, leaking through every crack, soaking every pallet. Isaac was hauling logs when he heard her cry, a sound not of pain, but of protest, sharp and short, swallowed by the overseer's voice. Jonathan Hale. The name would burn in Isaac's memory long after the rain dried. Rachel had been his only light in the long corridor of days. She was from a neighboring farm, sent often to the Brooks plantation to help with washing or mending. She had eyes like water before dawn, still and clear, and a voice that carried quiet hymns through the evening air when the others had collapsed in exhaustion. Isaac had loved her not loudly, but in the secret ways love survives under chains. A stolen glance at the well, a touch of hands when passing a bucket, a whispered dream beneath the cover of darkness. They had spoken of escape, though neither had maps nor money, only courage. They had imagined walking north until their feet bled, crossing rivers guided by stars, building a life without lashes or overseers. But that night, Jonathan Hale dragged her to the barn in front of others. He made a spectacle of his power, ripping her from the crowd of women who tried to shield her. "She belongs to the master now," he barked. Though everyone knew he claimed her for himself, Isaac had lunged forward, fists clenched, but two men held him back, whispering fiercely, "Stay down, Isaac, you'll die for nothing." He had obeyed in body but not in spirit. His soul screamed while his body shook with restraint. The barn doors closed, the storm roared, and when Rachel emerged hours later, her eyes were hollow, her dress torn, her hope extinguished. Within a week, she was gone. Sold south to a sugar estate in Louisiana, where men worked until their bones cracked and women bore children only to see them sold before their first steps. She had no chance to say goodbye. The ledger recorded her absence more faithfully than memory. Isaac did not eat for 3 days. The overseer whipped him for slowness on the 4th, and he bled into the soil where Cain would later grow tall. He did not cry. He did not curse. But where Rachel's smile had once lived in him, something darker took root. Where hope had been, fury began to coil. He began to change. The tools of labor became rehearsals for war. The ropes he hauled for timber were no longer just ropes, they were snares, weapons of strangulation in his mind's eye. The axe he swung to split wood was no longer just wood and iron. It became an extension of his arm, each thud of blade into trunk, a rehearsal for bone. Even silence changed meaning. It ceased to be submission and became shield, a cloak under which anger sharpened. Other slaves noticed. Isaac no longer joined in their whispered songs at night. He stopped laughing when children played, stopped speaking of tomorrow. His eyes followed the overseers with a new kind of stare, measured, watchful, dangerous. Some feared he had gone mad. Others whispered that he was awakening. One night, in the dim glow of fireflies, old Jacob, a man too crippled to work the fields, leaned close to Isaac. "Boy," he rasped, "I seen that look before. Your daddy had it, and they hanged him for less." Isaac did not answer. He kept staring at the ground. Jacob pressed on. Revenge is fire, and fire burns the hand that holds it. Isaac finally lifted his head, his voice steady but low. "Then let it burn." After Rachel's disappearance, he began to watch Jonathan Hale with the patience of a hawk. He studied the way Hale lingered near the stables after nightfall, the way he carried both whip and Bible, as though he believed cruelty and righteousness were the same cloth. He noted Hale's gait when drunk, his habit of boasting in front of the younger planters, his weakness for showing dominance in public. Isaac memorized these details, storing them like flint for the day a spark would come. The plantation around him carried on as if nothing had changed. The cane was cut, the sugar boiled, the master rode into town to give speeches about order and prosperity. But inside Isaac, the world had shifted. He no longer dreamed of flight northward with Rachel. That dream had been stolen. Now he dreamed only of judgment. The other slaves, though cautious, began to sense the storm forming in him. They saw the way he tightened knots with perfect precision, how he tested the edge of an axe after sharpening it, how his silence grew heavier than words. Whispers moved through the cabins. Isaac is not broken. Isaac is waiting. Fear began to tremble, not in him, but in those who watched him. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Isaac sat alone outside the quarters. He held a piece of rope in his hands, tying and untying it in complex patterns, as though weaving fate itself. Children ran by, laughing, but he did not look up. His eyes were far away, staring into some horizon, beyond cane and cabin, beyond chains and overseers. In his mind, Rachel's voice still lingered, soft as it once was. "One day, Isaac, one day we'll be free." But freedom, he realized, would not be given. It would not come with petitions or prayers, nor with waiting for the master's mercy. Freedom would have to be carved, seized, taken with hands scarred and strong. Freedom would not come in silence. It would come in blood. And so the man who once polished boots at the church gates, who once dreamed beneath stars with Rachel, became something else. He became a vessel of memory, a shadow of vengeance, a figure no longer content with survival. His heart, once tender with hope, now beat with the steady rhythm of war drums. Rachel's absence was his crucifixion. From it, Isaac rose not as a dreamer, but as a weapon. The church bells that once mocked Isaac with hymns of liberty became his measure of time. While others sang beneath their steeple, he listened to the rhythm of doors opening and closing, the coming and going of overseers, the patterns of boots against wooden floors. To Isaac, every sound became a note in a dark hymn of preparation. He worked the fields with the others, bending his back to cane and soil, but his mind wandered elsewhere. While his hands gripped the handle of the hoe, he was studying counting overseers, mapping their routines, noting who grew careless with drink, who lingered longest in town, who spent more time boasting than watching. Each weakness was a loose thread, and Isaac, like a patient hand at a loom, intended to pull until the whole cloth unraveled. Even in labor he trained. The ropes he tied for hauling became lessons in knots tight, silent, and unbreakable. He practiced until his hands moved without thought, looping and securing faster than most men could blink. The axe he swung to split wood became a companion, its weight familiar, its balance precise. He tested its edge with his thumb, feeling the bite of steel, imagining not bark, but bone. But more than tools, Isaac mastered patience. He learned to wait as the hawk waits, still as stone until the moment of strike. Anger without patience is a shout in the dark, quickly silenced. Patience makes anger eternal. The church, where he had once polished boots under jeers, became in his imagination the future stage of judgment. Each Sunday, while the congregation bowed their heads and spoke of freedom, Isaac knelt with them, eyes lowered, lips moving in false prayer. But inside he studied the building itself, the heavy oak doors, the narrow aisles, the pulpit where Jonathan Hale preached when the pastor faltered. Isaac traced each detail in memory, engraving it into his mind until the church ceased to be a sanctuary and became a gallows in waiting. It began small. A drunken overseer lingered too long near the stables one night, bottle in hand, voice slurred with arrogance. He called Isaac forward, demanded a song, mocked him for silence. Isaac said nothing. He waited until the man staggered close, then struck, quick, silent, final. The body fell among the hay, the bottle shattering beside it. Isaac dragged him into shadow, leaving no witness but the horses who blinked in silence. The next morning, whispers stirred among the cabins. No overseer came to count heads, no whip cracked at dawn. The body was found by noon, pale and still, the bottle blamed. Drank himself to death, they muttered, but in the eyes of the slaves a different truth glimmered. A man had fallen, and not by accident. Isaac gave no sign. He worked the fields as before, silent, obedient, head bowed. But in the cabins at night, eyes sought him out, some with fear, some with hope. For the first time, fear was shifting sides. Then came the young master, the boy whose boots Isaac had once polished at the church gates. Arrogant in youth, he delighted in humiliation, ordering slaves to dance clumsily for the amusement of white ladies, striking them when they faltered. He carried himself as though cruelty were inheritance, as though power were blood-born. Isaac endured it in silence until one evening the boy cornered him by the well, whip in hand, laughing. "Dance," he said. Isaac did not move. The boy raised the whip again. Isaac's stare stopped him. It was not rage but judgment, cold and sharp as steel. Before the whip could fall, Isaac struck. The knife was quick, the blow precise. No words passed between them, only the message carved into silence. The days of humiliation were over. The death was called accident, a stumble in the dark, a fall upon sharp tools. The whites grieved little. But among the slaves, whispers turned to murmurs. They said Isaac's eyes were not those of a man, but of a storm waiting to break. Children stared at him in awe. Women prayed quietly when he passed. Men nodded, not in open approval, but in recognition. Someone had answered the lash. Isaac began to move differently, not hastily, not proudly, still with the silence of obedience, but beneath it lay a new gravity. He carried himself not as a slave, but as a judge whose verdict had already been written. Even the overseers sensed it. Some avoided his gaze, others tightened their hold on the whip, trying to mask unease with violence. But fear cannot be hidden forever. It seeps into eyes, into hands, into the tremor of a voice when giving orders. Isaac saw it all. At night, when the cabins settled into uneasy sleep, Isaac remained awake. He sat outside beneath the fig tree, the same tree where Rachel had once lingered, watching the stars. He whispered her name into the dark, not as plea but as oath. each scar on his back burned like a brand, each one a chapter in a book of judgment he intended to finish. The slaves spoke of him in whispers: Isaac the silent, Isaac the shadow, Isaac who waits. They did not speak too loudly, for fear carries ears, but hope, even whispered, spreads faster than chains. For the first time, overseers looked over their shoulders at night. For the first time, the masters felt unease when their boots were polished, their meals served, their orders obeyed. Fear had shifted, and once fear moves, it does not return. Isaac knew the day would come when whispers would become cries, when silence would break like thunder, when the church that rang bells for freedom would instead echo with judgment. Until then, he sharpened his patience as carefully as his knife. And though no one yet knew it, the storm had already begun. The 4th of July came again 1 year later. The bells in the parish church rang as they had before, each toll swelling with the sound of liberty proclaimed. The square outside filled with white citizens, dressed in clean linen, their shoes shining, their laughter cutting across the heavy heat. Flags fluttered above the doors, fireworks cracked in the distance, and speeches poured from the mouths of planters and preachers alike, praising a freedom they guarded only for themselves. And into this crowd walked Isaac Brooks. He was dressed in coarse rags, the same garments that marked him as labor, as property, as less than human. Chains did not bind his wrists, but chains had marked his back, his heart, his very name. He moved with silence, as always. But this time the silence was not obedience, it was the silence of a storm before it breaks. At the gates of the church stood Jonathan Hale, the overseer who had stolen Rachel, who had dragged her to the barn before all eyes, who had laughed as he preached sermons of order and righteousness. In one hand he held a coiled whip, its leather gleaming in the sun. In the other, a Bible, as though cruelty and scripture were born of the same root. He stood tall before the people, the image of pious authority, his mouth already shaping the words of another sermon. Isaac's steps carried him closer. Each one was heavy, deliberate, a drumbeat of fate. The crowd was singing a hymn, their voices swelling in triumph, their eyes lifted toward heaven. None noticed the figure at first, moving through them like a shadow until silence spread in ripples. Heads turned. The hymn faltered. Jonathan Hale, whip and Bible in hand, locked eyes with the man who approached. Isaac said nothing. He drew the knife he had sharpened night after night, the blade reflecting both sun and shadow. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, at the threshold of that sacred building, where bells still rang in honor of freedom, Isaac drove the blade into Jonathan Hale. The overseer's eyes widened, his mouth opening not for scripture, but for a scream. The Bible slipped from his hand, pages fluttering like torn wings. The whip fell useless at his side. Blood spread across his shirt, soaking into the cloth, the stain of judgment written not in ink, but in flesh. The crowd gasped, then erupted in chaos. Women shrieked, men shouted, children cried. Some rushed forward, others stumbled back, trampling each other in panic. Isaac did not flee, he did not shout. He stood over the fallen man, the knife still warm in his hand, his chest rising with steady breaths. His eyes moved across the crowd, calm, unbroken, as if daring them to see him not as property, not as shadow, but as judge. They seized him within moments. The blow of boots and fists rained down, striking until his skin tore, until blood and dust clung to his face. They beat him with the fury of men who felt their order cracked. But Isaac did not cry out. He did not beg. His silence spoke louder than their violence. Even as they chained him, dragging him from the church steps, his head remained lifted. The trial was swift, more ritual than justice. They gathered in the courthouse within days, a building with white pillars that masked the rot within. Planters sat in judgment, their faces grave, their voices thick with outrage. Witnesses spoke of Isaac's silence, of his defiance, of the blade that struck down a righteous man. None spoke of Rachel, none spoke of the barn, none spoke of chains or whips or humiliation at the church gates. The verdict was already written before the first word was spoken. Guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. When they read it aloud, the crowd murmured in satisfaction, yet they looked to Isaac, expecting fear, pleading, perhaps madness. Instead, they found only stillness. His eyes did not lower, his lips did not tremble. Even when the noose was draped across his shoulder, he stood calm, as if the rope were nothing more than cloth. On the morning of his execution, the square filled again. White citizens pressed forward to see the spectacle, their children perched on shoulders, their wives clutching handkerchiefs as though attending a pageant. The gallows stood stark against the sky, a wooden frame waiting to swallow one more life. Isaac was brought forth in rags, his body marked with bruises, his back a tapestry of scars both old and new. The sheriff read the sentence in a trembling voice, though he tried to cloak it in authority. The crowd leaned closer, waiting for Isaac to break, but he did not. His head was high, his eyes steady. He looked not at the gallows, not at the rope, but at the people straight into their faces, into the eyes of men who believed themselves free. Some swore they saw a smile flicker across his lips, though faint, as though he carried within him a truth no rope could strangle. The trap door opened, the rope snapped taut, and Isaac Brooks, who once polished boots at the church gates, who once dreamed of Rachel beneath the stars, who once bore silence as a shield, was gone. The crowd dispersed quickly, muttering of rebellion, of madness, of the danger of giving slaves too much trust. But in the quarters, the story had already begun to spread, not as tragedy, not as warning, as witness. They said he stood like a man. They said he struck at the heart of cruelty itself. They said he looked into the eyes of freedom and proved that even the most humiliated could rise as judge. Children whispered his name in the dark. Mothers hummed it beneath their breath. Men spoke it softly when they sharpened their tools at night. The church where Jonathan Hale fell was no longer a place of liberty. For the enslaved, it became a place of memory. A place where bells once mocked them, but where judgment had spoken instead. And though Isaac Brooks died in rags, the silence he carried became thunder. The body of Isaac Brooks was lowered into the earth without prayer. The grave was shallow, unmarked, dug quickly beyond the town's edge. To the white citizens who watched his hanging, he was only a criminal, a madman who dared defy order. By dusk, they had already folded his name into silence, as though erasure could smother what had been witnessed. But memory does not obey decrees. In the cabins that night, whispers stirred like wind through dry cane. The slaves who had stood in the square carried the sight of him home, the rope against his skin, the unbroken gaze, the calm that mocked the gallows. They did not tell it as defeat. They told it as proof that one of their own had stood unbowed when chains demanded silence. Children listened wide-eyed as mothers bent close and spoke. Isaac did not die afraid. Men repeated the story in low tones by the fire, their words measured like prayer. He struck the whip itself, and the whip broke. Women wove his name into songs hummed while working, quiet enough to escape the overseer's ear, strong enough to keep memory alive. The whites called it rebellion. They warned one another that Isaac's example might spark more blood. They demanded tighter chains, harsher punishments, stricter laws to keep the quarters trembling. But none of their measures reached the silence where Isaac now lived. For the enslaved, his act was not rebellion. It was witness. The church where Jonathan Hale had fallen no longer rang with pure celebration. Its bells, once symbols of liberty, carried a different weight. To white citizens, they marked victory over defiance. To the enslaved, they marked a place where justice had spoken. Women passed it with their heads high, men paused in its shadow, children whispered, "That is where Isaac struck." The walls held the memory even when the congregation tried to wash it away. Years later, the story still traveled. Field hands in distant parishes heard of the man who polished boots on one July 4th and returned the next to carve freedom from hypocrisy. Runaways whispered his name as they crossed rivers in the night. Preachers in secret gatherings invoked him as proof that God's justice was not asleep. Even abolitionists in the North heard echoes of his defiance, retelling it as evidence that slavery bred its own destruction. Isaac Brooks had no tombstone, no epitaph, no carved letters to fix him in history. Yet he was remembered more fiercely than men who owned fields and sat in pews of honor. His scarred back became a legend, his silence a sermon, his knife a scripture. They said he stood calm at the gallows because he had already won. They said the rope took his breath, but not his voice. They said he died in rags, but left clothed in judgment. And so his name lingered, carried by mouths that could not be silenced. Isaac Brooks, the man who turned humiliation into fire, who turned silence into thunder. For the world of chains, he was a reminder that even the most broken could rise, that memory itself could sharpen into a blade, that no church bell could ring loud enough to drown out truth. In the end, he became more than a man. He became a symbol, a warning, a witness, a seed planted in the dark, waiting for freedom's harvest.